know how to use it. You feel good? All right, awesome. All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to May Hall. I'm Katie Curl-Dykman, the director of the Martin Institute of Law and Society, and was very honored to be asked to come here tonight and introduce you to this amazing panel. Specifically, I'm going to introduce you to the moderator, Mr. John Micek. He currently serves as the politics managing editor for MassLive. His career, which spans 3 decades, has taken him from small town meetings to Chicago City Hall, to Congress, and to Pennsylvania's Capitol. He contributes commentary and analysis to broadcast outlets in the United States, Canada, and the UK. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Mr. Micek. Thank you. Yeah, so I think that Peter said you were going to use. Is that good?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm John. If I do this right, you're not going to hear my voice at all tonight, and our amazing panel is going to do most of the talking. I will start to my left, your right. Meghan Hayes is a communications executive with West Shore Strategies. Her expertise extends to consulting for a diverse range of clients, including climate tech startups, political entities, and Fortune 100 companies. She recently served as Chief of Staff to the General Counsel and Global Head of Communications and Government Affairs at AIG Incorporated. Prior to that role, she spent 8 years as a senior communications leader for President Joe Biden, working alongside him from his vice presidency through his candidacy and into the White House. Her corporate communications expertise extends further during her tenure as the Executive Director of Enterprise Communications at MGM Resorts International. Please welcome Meghan Hayes. We have 2 Stonehill alums in the room tonight, and as I found out, a guy who grew up in the same hometown as I did, proving you can never really leave northwestern Connecticut because it follows you everywhere. Matt Gorman is a 2011 Stonehill grad. He's the executive vice president at Targeted Victory, where he leads the firm's strategic communication vertical, bringing over a decade of experience advising presidential candidates, members of Congress, and Fortune 50 companies on storytelling, media training, and managing crises. A veteran of 3 presidential campaigns, he most recently served as a senior advisor to Republican presidential candidate Tim Scott. Before that, he was the communications director for the National Republican Congressional Campaign Committee, where he was named to Politico Playbook's Power List. He also served as rapid response director and national spokesperson for Jeb Bush's 2016 presidential campaign, as well as an aide to Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign. Please welcome Matt Gorman. Jesse Hunt is a 2013 Stonehill grad. He's the founder of Monadnock Strategies, a political consulting firm. He was the first person to lead the communications department for both the Republican Governors Association and the National Republican Senatorial Committee, the latter of which for whom he was the youngest comms director in the committee's history. He previously guided U.S. Senate campaigns through a historically challenging political environment in 2020, with specifically tailored local messages that allowed Senate Republicans to win important races in Iowa, Maine, Montana. Montana, I have a lot to say about that tonight, I'm sure, and North Carolina. Hunt also served as National Press Secretary for the National Republican Congressional Committee, comms director for U.S. Senator Richard Burr's successful 2016 reelection campaign, and as a spokesperson for Governor Jeb Bush's presidential campaign. Additionally, he worked in communications roles on other U.S. Senate campaigns, including Ambassador Scott Brown's 2014 campaign in New Hampshire. Please welcome Jesse Hunt. And the last shall be first. Joel Payne is the Chief Communications Officer for MoveOn.org, an organization whose members are committed to an inclusive and progressive future marked by equality, sustainability, justice, and love. Prior to his current role, he has worked for a number of politicians, including Senator Frank Lautenberg of New Jersey, Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan, and Representative Barbara Lee of California. He has held roles for the Senate Democratic Policy Committee, the AFL-CIO Working for America Institute, Hillary for America, and the Hub Project. He regularly offers political commentary for CBS News. Please welcome Joel Payne. I'm going to go over here. that works. All right, we'll start, Meghan, with you. I'm going to try something unusual first. This campaign in one word.
Surprising.
Over.
Historic.
Unprecedented.
Now I will go in for the standard journalist question of why. What stood out for you?
I think that when the nominee, the sitting president, steps off the ticket, it's a little bit shocking to everyone. So that was a pretty surprising move.
I mean, a little more seriously, it was very predictable until it wasn't, right? We had a nominee from, both have been nominated before, both have served president before, and then suddenly, just when we thought it was going to be predictable, kind of the same old, you had the debate on June 27th, and from June 27th through really, the end of July, we had 30 to 60 days of just unprecedented change that we've never seen before in a presidential campaign. This attempted assassination attempt, change in candidacy, and then obviously a vice presidential pick, which we did not expect on the Democratic side. So it was something that became very, very sleepy to a massively changed race in about 30 to 60 days.
Very similar for the reasons that Matt just laid out. It's not often you were to see, a change in the incumbent president being the nominee at such a late time in the election season. To have the Republican nominee survive 2 assassination attempts and then have it culminate in, the Republican nominee who had previously had trouble winning the popular vote. Ultimately, I think they're probably still counting some votes in California, but it looks like not only is he going to win the electoral vote, but the popular vote as well. And so I think all those factors, it's very historic.
Just to expand on the unprecedented piece, I think that this cycle, to me, challenged a lot of conventional wisdom and a lot of kind of generally accepted norms that us as political professionals and I think our industry likes to rely upon. Kamala Harris in the last few weeks of the race had a muscular organization on the ground, knocking doors, all the metrics, the quantitative stuff that you measure to figure out whether or not a campaign is strong, it seemed like she was, and it seemed, frankly, the opposite for her opponent, Donald Trump. And I think the unprecedented piece comes in, there's this realignment, but there's also this shift maybe in how we're measuring political strength and political salience in this moment. And so to me, I think this is a moment for smart people to be open to changing their mind about kind of long-held conventional wisdoms.
Talk a bit more about that realignment, if you would. What did you see and what happened?
Yeah, I think the realignment, for a long time, there are parts of the Democratic electorate that were reliable based across race and gender and geography. And I think some of those things have started to change. It's very clear that Donald Trump was able to tap into a vein with working class Americans, and not just working class Americans who are white. We're talking, he saw big movements in African American, well, maybe not big, not quite as big with African Americans, but particularly with Latino communities, AAPI communities. I think also realignment in terms of the geographies of like where some of those shifts happen. Trump grew his vote share in a lot of urban areas. That was, so I was sitting on a TV set, probably like a lot of these folks, on election night, and the thing that jumped out the most to me when, from my perspective, I knew it was going to be a bad night, was when you started to see some of the vote share that was coming in from some of these urban areas, New York City, LA, Houston, Detroit, et cetera, typically Democratic strongholds that just the numbers weren't there or the margins weren't there. They were winning them, but not winning them by big enough numbers. And so, again, just a time for a smart political professional to challenge some of their conventional wisdom.
He won almost 40% in Queens, the borough of Queens, New York, right? That was a borough that had Mitt Romney won almost about 12% in 2012, and it was around that same area in 2016, got 12%. Trump won a precinct in Chicago proper, the precinct that houses the Cook County Jail, right? The win precincts in Chicago as Republicans unheard of. And so that's how you end up looking. Of course, he won the 7, major swing states, but that's how you get margins like 6 in New Jersey, and Illinois was, in single digits. It's unheard of,
What were you seeing, Meghan, in those numbers and in those shifts?
I agree with everyone here. I think that Democrats were misjudging what the electorate that was coming out. It wasn't voting for Democrats. And I think when they started to see the numbers for Philadelphia, there was a lot of turnout. But then when they actually started to see the numbers coming in, there were people turning out. They just weren't voting traditionally how they would vote for in the past. So they just weren't voting the same way. And I think that's what really hurt Democrats. And I think going to your point about being unprecedented, when you are, you know, when a Republican is getting 40% of the vote in Queens, Democrats are going to have a real problem everywhere else in the country. And I think that was very clear as we saw the numbers come in.
It was a change election. You had about 2/3 of the country that said we were on the wrong track. And I actually do believe that you should probably give some credit to the Harris team and what they were able to do in battleground states. If you look at outside of the battleground states, the massive shift that occurred in New Jersey, in Illinois, New York, these blue states moved dramatically toward Trump, and that just goes to show you at a mass level, at a macro level, whose message was actually penetrating, where were most of the voters starting to gravitate toward. That was something that campaign mechanics, spending, field organization, they would never be able to contend with that. Ultimately, you had a large swath of people who remembered what it was like under Donald Trump, and they were evaluating it based on that sort of comparison. Was life better for them under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? And again, going back to 2/3 of the country feeling like we're on the wrong track, that was just an overwhelming force in a lot of voters' decision making.
We had a bit of breaking news going into this afternoon. It feels like we always have breaking news going into the day. But Ann Seltzer, the veteran Iowa pollster, announced she was stepping down after getting a planned exit, but she had that poll just before the election that showed that race a lot tighter than it was. That ended up not being the case. We all went into, at least those of us on my side of the street going in, thought it was a much closer race than it was going to be. Clearly, by the time the night shook down, it was not. Once again, we find ourselves in the same place we were in 2016, asking ourselves about the utility of polling, asking ourselves about the usefulness of polling. And I wonder if the model is blown up. I mean, if it's just not worth it anymore, or where, what lessons have been learned and have not been learned. And Matt, we'll start with you. Actually,
yeah.
Jesse,
I have some very strong
Oh,
thoughts.
yeah, here we go.
Polling was designed for political professionals to use it to make strategic decisions. It wasn't meant to be predictive. You can't determine what the composition of the electorate is going to be prior to an election. So that's why there are very, very smart Republican pollsters, very, very smart Democratic pollsters. Just because they have different internal numbers doesn't mean either are wrong. That's why there is a margin of error. A lot of time, those outcomes, the polling that you see is based on the composition. It might be too male versus not enough female, it might be way more female. The response rates among Democrats, if you talk to anyone in the media industry who conducts media polls, if you talk to folks who do it on the R side or the D side, it is so much easier to get Dem responses, and sometimes that can skew the way that the polls look. So they're not necessarily missing as much. Ann Seltzer's set that aside. Her model was a bit outdated, and some of the methodology that she uses based on what we know how to reach voters nowadays. It's very difficult. Like random digit dialing is not necessarily the best method to utilize if you're trying to get a read on your electorate. But I just think so much of what we see from like the national conversation is too much. It's all horse race driven, it's all poll driven, but those polls were never meant to predict the outcome. They're so that we know, hey, as political professionals, we're not doing as well among seniors in the Green Bay DMA or in the Charlotte DMA. We're struggling with suburban men. And then we can course correct and make paid spending decisions to try to lift that support. And I think we've kind of gotten away from it a little bit, what it was intended to be.
Everybody knew the Seltzer thing on both sides was a bullshit poll. Like everybody knew going in, because like what happened was Seltzer is really good, and she can take good data. And this is how in 2014, she was one of the first pollsters to see Joni Ernst, who's a current senator from Iowa, who was an underdog rising in these rural areas. And the reason is because almost every other pollster models what they think the electorate will be, and they have the poll and almost reverse engineer it to what they think. Okay, it's going to be X% Democrat, X% Republican, X% Independent. She kind of divides up the state regionally and geographically and doesn't stop calling in the region until she gets a sufficient number of responses in that region. Now, it's really good, again, like I said, if you want to pick up something happening in the rural areas of the state. But in the era of Trump, and Jesse hits it exactly right, we're in this weird era, and I understand why beforehand it sounds like BS when I tell you this, but afterwards you can kind of see what I'm talking about, the election. Essentially, there's Democratic super voters who, how many of you guys ever taken a poll? Like any of you, a few of you? It's not quick. It takes a little time. So it's a commitment. And people, like Democratic super voters, will spend 20 minutes on the phone with a pollster telling you all the different ways they hate Donald Trump and cannot wait to vote against him. So it skews the poll in a way where you get more Democratic responses than you would. I mean, like for example, Democrats, the economy as an issue for Democrats was in the single digits. Single digits. No other poll had that. So there's little hints like that. And also, they didn't release what we call the recall Joe Biden number, which would be like if they ran the 2020 election again and it was Biden versus Trump, who would you vote for, right? If they ran it under the current conditions, it would have been about a +5 Biden number, right? So that was a telltale sign that things were seriously off, and I think I'd agree.
I also think that we live in a 24-hour news cycle, and we need something to drive the narrative, and they're using polling. I mean, how many times do we all have to respond to polling on TV? And it's like every other day there was a new poll from a new organization, and so it drives a lot of the narrative, and it really just makes it, but the problem is the viewership isn't there, so what's happening on TV and in the polls isn't what's happening on the ground, and I think that's another thing we saw with the polling too. It just wasn't, I mean, to your point, it wasn't accurate, but it just, everyone thought it was accurate because that's what the narrative was on TV, and we were the ones watching TV.
Yeah, my Republican brothers here are fired up about this thing,
yeah,
which I appreciate. No, I share a lot of the sentiment. I think, particularly your point, I've always been taught as a political professional, polling is directional. You really, it helps to know, like, okay, 6 months ago or 12 months ago, 30% of the country felt this way, and now 40. Maybe it's 32 and 39, or maybe it's, 28 and 41. But if you can track it directionally, that helps us make decisions, advise people, come up with talking points, come up with ad campaigns, figure out what our weaknesses are. But yeah, it's not supposed to be determinative of an electorate. The problem is that maybe it is a problem. We have created a punditized, electorate, right? Folks who, because we are all so anxious about these elections and we want to know what's going to happen and we're looking for any hint to predict. My theory is that we have essentially created a pundit class of voters who don't just tell you what they think, they tell you what they think their neighbors think. Or, well, I heard, it's kind of like the economy. Essentially, yeah. I'd be curious if everyone up here agrees. The economy question is pretty much a ballot test now. I saw something that within the 2 weeks since the election, Republicans have miraculously shot up their feelings about how the economy is doing, because Donald Trump has not yet taken office yet, but they feel better about the economy because he was elected and he's the president-elect now. And by the way, I'd bet you if you did that polling on the other side, you could probably track a similar number with Democrats. We have created a scenario where you have these ballot tests that come through with polling. And so to answer your original question, I think polling can be helpful as long as it's taken into account with a lot of other factors and it's not singular in how you do your work.
And give you guys a chance to play amateur media critic as well. I mean, we had so many internal discussions about polling. Which one? There's so many out there. Some with smaller sample sizes, some with bigger margins. Which ones do you use? Which ones are the more reliable barometers? I mean, does it get to a point where it's just sort of like this self-perpetuating kind of polling media cycle thing?
Yeah, well, also types, right? So there's quantitative and qualitative. So I'm a big fan of qualitative, which is focus groups, IDIs, opportunities to not just kind of chart a number or kind of see how many people responded to a phone call, but ask a follow-up question. And if you have really kind of smart, opinion research experts who are working with you, they can do the types of follow-up questions to say, well, why do you not feel good about the state of the economy? Or why did you like this versus that? I like being able to do more in-depth follow-up. And so honestly, like, with the folks who I work with and the things that I rely upon, I tend to like qualitative a little bit more than quantitative.
And to your point on the democracy question, Democrats really hung their hat on democracy, the threat to democracy, and I thought that every person always in the top three all of the time. They're like, oh, everyone's going to turn out and vote for the Democrat because of the threat to democracy. Democrats were not taking into account that Republicans felt like Democrats were a threat to democracy and everything they had done. So without the follow-up question, we didn't have their correct information. We just assumed that everyone that was saying that was an important issue to them, that they were going to vote for a Democrat, and it just didn't turn out to be true.
Democracy is a code word for I'm very scared of where the country's going, right? Like it's a seafood stew of a lot of what they view as kind of like, threats to your livelihood, threats to the country, and you can read into that, but it's not, the Bill of Rights per se, as written.
And there need to be follow-up questions. I mean, how many speeches, how many events, how many ads did the Democrats and the vice president put out that really targeted at that? And it was having the opposite effect on people, and I don't think we realized that until election day.
This democracy thing, I can tell you, just early conversations with what you might call the progressive left, there's a lot of, self-analysis and gut checking about, maybe where did we go wrong in terms of how we frame this issue publicly. I think one thing that is pretty clear, it does seem like much of the public views democracy as a stand-in for the establishment or the system. And here's the problem if you're a Democrat. Essentially, when you go and you say, we are trying to protect democracy, yeah, there are some voters who hear that and say, we're trying to protect democratic norms, we're trying to stop a president from throwing their political enemies in jail. But there are many other voters who say, why are you trying to protect a system that I know is broken? A healthcare system that's broken, a criminal justice system that's broken, an economy that's broken. They hear the coding differently, which I think is part of the point you were making, Matt.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In terms of like Joel's talking about what like polling and the focus groups, and for those of you, like, I don't know if you ever participated in a focus group, but those are incredibly helpful for political professionals because that steers a lot of the messaging, that steers a lot of the, it allows you to go deeper into what in a poll is a crosstab, which shows exactly which kind of demographic data, age, race, education, income level. Well, you can drill down even more on what people are really feeling, what you all are feeling. Oftentimes, we are not very good at our jobs if we don't listen to you, telling us what it is that you're concerned about, the way that you see the country, the way that you see our particular candidates. It's very, very illuminating. And that stuff is not as sexy for cable news conversations or for social media. It's very labor intensive. It doesn't make for quick, easy sound bites or headlines, right? Like Trump's leading Harris in Michigan by 2, right? Like that's something that everyone can talk about at the next time they go and hang out with their friends or send it in a group chat or something like that. Sort of stuff that we're talking about, that other focus group data, that qualitative data is far more illuminating and allows you to kind of really truly get an understanding of which direction the country wants to head in.
Now that we're sort of talking about issues in the campaign, additional breaking news today: the president-elect saying he intends to declare a national emergency on day one, use military assets to engage in this mass deportation he promised on the campaign trail. I mean, Matt, from where you're sitting, talk to me about sort of the resonance of immigration, one, as a campaign issue, and two, like in theory and in practice, how much trouble will he have or not in sort of implementing that now that he's promised that he's going to do it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I can't overemphasize the importance of immigration, and I think what the difference was in this campaign, in a real way, was immigration was no longer a issue along the border, right? You saw, of course, Texas counties that were Democratic for decades that go 70% Hillary counties along the border there went for Trump, right? You saw there's a little red line right on the kind of the southwestern edge of Texas going Trump. Immigration, especially with the migrant crisis, brought it into communities that never had to deal with this stuff before. Like suddenly, sanctuary cities were kind of put to the test, where it's like, here you go. Here are 10,000 migrants that we just kind of grabbed from border that we can't handle. Take them. And I mean, Jesse, I know you've been to the border. I've been to the border. I'm sure you guys have too. Like, it was eye-opening for me. I went to the Yuma, Arizona sector last August, and you go there and you see the wall, and there's an Indian reservation right alongside it, so you could see very clearly how folks get in every night, and they take their shoes off, throw their IDs away, But more importantly, the point of it is you see how it strains the social service sector, hospitals, police, all of that. And that was something that was isolated for many years along the border state governors, Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, California, and people saw it in their own communities. And I think that is a huge difference, number one. And number two, I think, look, Donald Trump believes, I think rightly, he has a relative mandate on enacting particularly economic and immigration policies. So if you expect him to moderate or kind of peel this thing back or not really give lip service to what he's talking about in the campaign, I think you're mistaken. He will, I think, he'll start with kind of the violent criminal aspect, folks who are already in the ICE system. I'm not an expert on this, and then kind of go from there. But he will not be compromising on those two issues in particular.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I was just going to say, before the election even occurred, it was broadly understood by a lot of the American media that Trump had already won from a conversation standpoint. Because if you remember where the conversation went and where Kamala Harris had to go on the issue of immigration, on a handful of other issues too, energy, fracking in the state of Pennsylvania is a major issue. But really on immigration, there were significant attempts to kind of erase her previous positions, erase the first 2 years of the Biden administration and certain policies that they pursued or certain executive actions that they walked back from the Trump era. So just from a conversation standpoint, if you just listen to what the two candidates were saying, that was very much, and this is why Trump won, he was basically playing, at a home field advantage, right? They were talking about the issues that he cared about, and the country overwhelmingly supported that perspective. So I don't think that there's any reason for him to kind of, I would say, moderate whatever his plans are. That's what the country decided that they wanted to support, and he's going to go forward with vigor.
Yeah. Well, this might be just a honest disagreement here between friends. I mean, look, I think it's all about how you shape the mandate, right? How do you judge the results of this election? I think many Republicans would love to kind of say this is a strong mandate for Donald Trump to go and, do kind of the full MAGA on all the stuff that he believes. Also, it could just be similar to 2020. The American people just said, we don't like the current person in the White House because they fired Donald Trump in 2020, right? And they just fired Joe Biden now. That's not necessarily an affirmation of the person that's coming behind them, right? Like some people who would critique Joe Biden might say, well, Joe Biden tried to do too much and go too big because he read his mandate as going big, right? There are certainly like groups like ours who are happy he went big because that's the work that you would want a Democratic president to do. But, there's parts of the electorate that might say, no, that's not exactly why you won the election. So like reading why you win an election is very important. I'd say Donald Trump won this election because of two reasons. Democrats lost two kind of meta conversations. One, the American people think Donald Trump's first presidency was good. In retrospect, they think it was good. They think that they've kind of blocked out the 10 months in 2020 when we were all in our homes, and they think that his first term was good, and they think that Joe Biden's presidency was bad. To me, that's why Donald Trump won this election. I think that all the kind of lurching to the right on immigration policy and even tariff stuff, I mean, that stuff doesn't even make any sense if you want to fight inflation, if you want to kind of protect what is now a booming economy. I mean, go talk to some business folks who rely upon a lot of skilled, low-wage workers who will be impacted by some of the things that Donald Trump wants to do. I don't think that's going to feed that economic mandate that voters do want the president to protect. But this battle that you're seeing right now, this difference in reading of the mandate, this will be a lot of the work of the next year to figure out, well, what do the American people mean? You heard my perspective on it. I think that my Republican friends will probably say that Trump doesn't need to moderate. I think in a year, if Donald Trump goes and disrupts people's lives and sends law enforcement into businesses and creates some really ugly scenes, I don't think it's going to be a good situation politically for Republicans.
I agree with that. I think if you start taking people from churches and schools, it's going to be those are some optics that are going to be hard for him to overcome. But I do agree with you that a lot of immigration, I think, is based in fear. And I think this is where social media played well for Donald Trump, is they were able to put fear into people's minds that immigrants were taking their jobs, and it all comes back to the economy. And it all comes back to the economic message that they weren't doing well in their own checkbooks and their own kitchen table issues. And so then when you have other issues coming into play, that someone's going to take your job or people are coming here, it is a lose-lose situation. I do not think that he's going to be as aggressive as you guys are saying with his immigration policy. I just don't think the mandate's there. I think the midterms will be really terrible for Republicans, but that's just the honest disagreement.
No, I mean, look, I see Joel's point. Look, I think the original stint of the Biden administration was Biden was elected to cool the temperature in the country. He wasn't elected to be FDR. He thought he was elected to be FDR. I think that was where you saw the spending, which led to inflation, which led to a lot of other things. And look, we talk about polls, right? I always say, like, watch their actions, not their words, right? So kind of to go off what Jesse said, what was telling for me, and what was telling obviously what Democrats must have saw in their polling, was if you're endorsing a bill that goes through Congress that, I mean, for 20 years, the precursor for any sort of border security, any sort of fencing back in the day, the wall, whatever it is, there was always a pathway to either legal status, usually citizenship. The Overton window shifted. Suddenly, Democrats were like, we'll just do the border security now. Like, well, so obviously something in their polling showed a serious vulnerability on that issue. They didn't need to do the other part anymore. And that tells me that, like, it was popping in the polling. People, in a way it hadn't before.
I think it's been popping in the polling in 2019. I mean, it did pop in the polling in 2019 when Joe Biden was running, and I think it was popping in 2020 and 2021. But I do think that there were other issues that were taking over at the time. So COVID was a huge issue in 2020. So immigration was not as big of an issue, for the electorate. And I just think, again, back to the economy, when you have things that are so negative, every other negative issue comes to play.
I actually think, and I think we talked about a little bit of this offline, some of the sentiment that voters had may not even have to necessarily do with immigration policy in itself. It was more of a priority. Like, where are your priorities? Who are you focused on helping? There are plenty of people out here who are struggling with, a 20 plus, about 20% cumulative inflation. Yet you have a Democratic Party that is more focused on making sure the rights of these, the migrants coming across the border are taken care of here in your cities or in border states. And I think that created a sort of animosity I think a lot of voters had toward the current administration that didn't feel like it was prioritizing their concerns.
Well, and to your point, a lot of the sanctuary cities have really high homeless problems, like San Francisco or LA, and I think their citizens are seeing that if you're taking care of this group of people and not taking care of this group of people, where are your priorities? And I think that, again, plays into voting for a change candidate.
Yeah, somewhat related. Look, I'm very stubborn on this point. Joe Biden, Kamala Harris lost this election because Joe Biden never regained altitude from a couple of events early in his presidency. The first thing that cut at the kind of Biden coalition, which was always a coalition of, I say this respectfully, of convenience. It wasn't a coalition of passion because it was an anti-Trump coalition. It came together to defeat Donald Trump. When the Afghanistan withdrawal by many measures did not go well, it cut at the one core thing that Joe Biden was able to hold over Donald Trump in 2020. I am competent, right? I can do this job better than you. Now, I've worked in government, I can offer a lot of explanations about how things happen, that he was executing policy that Donald Trump signed off on, and that actually they went and did a great job of getting people out of harm's way after. But the image that was emblazoned with the American people was that was a failure and that was a lack of competence. And if you notice in polling, which we've all talked about being flawed, there was an altitude that Joe Biden never was able to regain after that, and then it kind of jumped back down again after what happened in Gaza. And there was always the steady hum of this economic recovery that never recovered maybe as fast for some people as we wanted it to because you made all these investments that led to inflation. And so that was really just a toxic mix that Joe Biden presided over and Kamala Harris inherited that baggage.
It's chaotic failure too, like the chaos
Yeah.
of it, and then cut to the thing. Yeah.
And this is so I worked at the Republican Governors Association in 2021 and 2022. So I had the good fortune of seeing expensive internal private data on how that race was playing out, and that race was bubbling, right? It was competitive over the summer, but it really was had a cascading effect on Democrats' hopes in that gubernatorial race and some of the other races that were going on in New Jersey at that time. We could see those in live time because of the issue related to competence. Inflation was already starting to hurt people in their pocketbooks, and it just wasn't a reassuring image for a lot of folks who had selected Joe Biden because they thought he was going to return a sense of normalcy. Well, at the end of the day, it looked very chaotic at a time that they started to develop a lot of economic angst, and he'd never recovered from that.
Really quickly, there are a lot, people misunderstand, I think, the country sometimes too. You have a lot of states that always vote Democratic or always vote Republican, but I call them, that might be a Republican state, but that's not a red state. Or that might be a Democratic state, but that's not a blue state. Like New Jersey, I'm from New Jersey. Okay, New Jersey is a Democratic state. It's not a blue state. It's a very diverse state. We've had Republican governors in my lifetime, as recently as within the last 10 years. We've had Republican representation at the federal level across the board. Virginia is a it's a Democratic state, but it's not a blue state. I would say Republicans have states like that too, like Georgia right now might feel like it's a Republican state, but it's not a red state. And I think there's a fundamental misread in this realignment that we kind of talked about earlier. That's impacting how people judge some of those places.
It goes to the most, I think, important dividing line and the clearest dividing line of your politics right now. It's essentially level of education or working class or white collar, blue collar, right? Like New Jersey is by more, except some New York suburbs, very blue collar, right? Virginia more white collar. Again, I'm generalizing here, but the predominant of the population, right? And so you're right. You are finding politics divided by class, especially this last election, in a way that it's the clearest indicator of your political leanings, at least as of 2 weeks ago.
Matt, I think you can have the same conversation here in Massachusetts. You drive down to the South Coast, down into Bristol County, into your New Bedfords and your and Fairhavens and Acushnets and that kind of thing, where you do have that sort of bluish to purple electorate. And then, obviously, we can stipulate that they called the race roughly within 15 seconds for Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren on election night. But there were towns out west that had never gone red before.
Yes.
That had. So I wonder, even in this sort of like blue bubble that we're in here, I wonder what the takeaway is there for you.
I mean, those areas certainly got progressively more red. You go out west on 90 longer. I mean, that's where you're from, Jess. You could probably talk about it too. But like also, the Cape. Like I was on NBC at 6 a.m. They hadn't yet called the Cape congressional seat, and that was like, it should be a no-brainer, right? And so, even in Torrington, where I'm, Litchfield County, where you and I are both from, right? That's white working class. Trump won a county in Connecticut for the first time in a long time. He won Tolland County in the northeast part. So it is absolutely, you see an exchange. I mean, Jesse, Yeah.
So I'm from northern Worcester County, and I grew up, we had Mitt Romney ended up becoming the Republican nominee who was the governor of the state. There weren't that many Mitt Romney supporters in 2012, right? There was just an area that went huge for Barack Obama. I woke up in 2016 to see that the entire northern Worcester County had flipped to becoming Trump supporters. This is an area that was dominated by furniture manufacturing, tool manufacturing, toy manufacturing, and that had completely been hollowed out. And you have a lot of, working class voters who feel like they have been left behind, right? Everything growing up, you could hear all the jobs are inside the 495 belt. I went and looked at the results just 2024 here, and I think the last time I saw, my town I grew up in went 15% for Trump. This is in a state, Massachusetts, right, where Kamala Harris won by an overwhelming margin. But you have this same sort of division playing out within this state that you're seeing more broadly throughout America. Just taking again, going, Worcester County, if you look at towns like Shrewsbury, Westboro, Hopkinton, Harvard, like your more white collar, upscale, college to college plus homes, they actually went for larger margins for Kamala that I ever saw that when Mitt Romney ran in 2012. I thought just the Romney race in 2012, I had been helping out. It was my first experience. I got it through this great university here, working on Scott Brown's Senate race in 2012. So I got to see the Romney, Obama divide and Scott Brown, Elizabeth Warren divide. And those were towns that we relied on as Republicans. Republicans trying to win in the state. Republican, your white collar communities that were voting for Charlie
Country
Baker.
Club Republicans.
Yeah, they were voting for Charlie Baker over Martha Coakley, right, in huge numbers. It's not necessarily the case anymore, and I think that speaks to the class divide that we're now seeing that is very determinative when you look at party breakdown, or at least who they're supporting. I wouldn't say party breakdown. I would say who they're supporting in given elections, because we come post-ideological, post-party in some cases.
Meghan, do you think Mass Dems understand that, or have they gotten a little too cushy with the supermajorities?
I'm not from here, I'm from California, so I'm not exactly sure what Mass Dems are feeling, but I would imagine just like in California, because California is also a very conservative state with pockets of blue, and it votes Democratic just because of its population, but it's actually very conservative. I don't think people realize how easy it is that some of these places could turn very quickly. And I don't think people are really recognizing the education divide and the working class divide as much, because when you are educated and you are making more money, the cost of eggs going up $1 doesn't impact you, where it does impact a working class family making significantly less. And I've said it 6 times, the economy is what's driving this. And I think that until Democrats and Republicans did it great this cycle, really focus on the economy, that's where they're going to win their votes, because the electorate is mostly working class folks.
In 2030, we're going to reapportion the census, right? And on track right now, as of today, California is set to lose by 4 or 5 seats. New York's set to lose about 4. Pennsylvania's about to lose 1. That's going to Florida. That's going to Texas, about to either 4 or 5 each. So you could essentially win the presidency. We don't even care about the blue wall anymore. Like Wisconsin, Michigan, you don't need it. You can do it just through Arizona, Florida, Texas. You just go through right up what Trump did anyway. Arizona, Nevada, and all that. You don't need it. So the census coming up in a little bit of time is going to be a huge implications for the next electoral college after this 2028.
Yeah, I'm interested to dig into that a little bit more too, because you're right. Those do have big implications. I think sometimes the public doesn't kind of understand that. The economy, I think, has generally shifted to become a cultural issue. And I say that very specifically because, again, the policy, like there's a very hot conversation that's going on among Democrats right now about like, oh, we got to appeal to the working class more. And I want to underscore the term appeal. It's not really about policies. I mean, if you're talking about policies, like, and we could have an honest disagreement about this, the policies that Joe Biden focused on during his presidency, that Kamala Harris talked about, those are things that should land and register very well. I'm not saying that there are no Republican Trump policies that do that, but there are some that work very counter to the interests of working class people. And I think one of the things that Republicans are going to have to quarrel with is Donald Trump running that type of campaign very class-based, and now got Elon Musk flanking him on one side, and he's going to have another corporate oligarch flanking him on another side, and that's not going to wear well, right? That's like particularly when you pass a tax bill where they're already talking about, well, we're going to snip at Medicaid a little bit, and we're going to take a little money from this social safety net program to pay for these tax cuts and to pay for government contracts for people like Elon Musk. It's not going to register well. But Republicans won the culture war on the economy. And I think that's a thing that Democrats have to understand is like, how do we relate to the American people that we understand, like not just that we have policies that work for you, but that we understand your journey culturally related to the economy. And that's a place where Democrats have a lot of work to do.
We have about 10-ish minutes left. We have these 2 microphones up front here. So if anyone is burning up with questions, in the time that we have left, please come down and ask them. If anybody is. Going once. Okay.
Thank you, Tom Maloney, Stonehill, class of '81, and a great program. Thank you very much. A question, first of all, one observation and one question real quickly. We talk about this election as if it were a landslide or a blowout, but actually, in spite of all the unusual characteristics, Trump's personality, Biden getting out, Harris getting in, it really fell out like a normal presidential election. The winner's going to win by about 1.8% in the popular vote, and the Electoral College is going to exaggerate that to make it look great. That's usually what happens in these, isn't that right? It's a close race. It was a close race. The other question I have is that we're at Stonehill College here. Maybe you did cover this, I came in late, but one of the interesting demographic things is that Donald Trump in this election polled the greatest share of Catholic voters, I think, by a Republican ever. Certainly in the days of exit polling, according to the New York Times. He polled about 57% of the Catholic vote overall. That's the highest percentage by a Republican probably ever. Just want to know what you all have to say about that. Is that an important fact here? And is it the indication of the beginning of a trend? Thank you.
As an alumni of Stonehill College and a practicing Catholic from Massachusetts, which there are quite a few of us here in Massachusetts. Yeah. Look, I think it is a sign of, if you're self-identifying as a Catholic today, and you know and you care about that, and religion is an important part of your life, there's a certain cultural conversation that we're having right now. It's uncomfortable sometimes for people to have, but it's playing out in schools, it's playing out in sports, it's playing out in Washington, D.C., it's playing out in Beacon Hill, it's playing out everywhere. And I think, like, looking at that specific figure, it does not surprise me, and I think that's only going to grow given some of the things that you typically hear at church, especially as it relates to the issue of life, which is just a pillar of Catholic teaching. And obviously that became a huge topic of conversation following the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade in 2022. So I think that's a lot of what's fueling that recent shift among self-identifying Catholics is, you're going to gravitate toward certain politicians that might be speaking your language, for a lack of a better word, as it relates to the cultural things that you find important.
I mean, look, the number one of the two counties I was watching most closely on election night was Lackawanna County, right? Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, and that was ancestral home of Joe Biden, right? And Obama won that in 2012 by about 28 points. Hillary won it by 3 in 2016, okay? Then Biden, because I think in his ancestral home, won it by 9 in 2020. So what I was going into the night looking, okay, was the Trump 2016 an aberration? Is it gonna go back up to 9, if not more? Or was the Trump 2016 where this is really headed and there was a Biden bump? And Trump lost it by 3 points. Harris won it by 3. These are Irish Catholic Democrats outside of Scranton. These are people who you're talking about. And I think you're right. And it was culture. But it goes back to the other part of this, too. I mean, the most famous ad of the campaign was Kamala Harris talking about, sex changes for inmates, taxpayer funded. And so it wasn't really about that issue. I think to Joel's point and Jesse's point, it was about culture and about priorities, right? Are your priorities, here or are they there? And like all great ads, it says something that's beyond what's actually in the ad. It's more a little bit more impactful than that.
Meghan, Joel, I'm going to put that to you. I mean, I was out in 22 in the Philadelphia suburbs, your Bucks counties, your Montgomery counties, right after the Dobbs decision came down, and the wave of anger the Democrats rode that year blunted the red wave, did not give them back the House. Harris doubled down on reproductive rights this cycle. It helped her, did it help her? But apparently not enough.
So first, I'm also a practicing Catholic. I went to Catholic school, kindergarten through 12th grade, and I agree with you that Democrats are losing Catholics because of choice and some of these other cultural issues. I also think that when people have referendums in their states and they were able to vote on it on a state level, they didn't see the necessity to then vote on it at the top of the ticket. So I think that a lot of people could feel comfortable protecting reproductive freedoms, and I think that's why it was important for the message shift for Democrats to go to reproductive freedoms rather than talk about abortion and the how many weeks and get into the specifics, because it made it about women making choice for their own body, and most women can understand that differently than abortion. And so then they were able to protect it in their own states and still vote for Trump because they wanted somebody who was better on the economy.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about mandates earlier, and again, this is all about how you read the mandate. I mean, there was a ballot initiative in Florida that failed. This was a 60% threshold. Almost 58% of Floridians, with Ron DeSantis as their governor, said they wanted expanded access to abortion rights. And so that, to me, is data for how a President Trump is going to maneuver around the issue of abortion access. There's a lot of talk about, could they implement the Comstock Act? Would he sign a national abortion ban? I don't want to register an opinion on that because I don't want to be in a position of predicting something that Donald Trump does, which is not a very good bet. But I would say this. I think that Donald Trump, better than most Republicans, understands the sensitivity of the issue of abortion, and frankly, he muddied his position on abortion enough to where there was enough of the electorate that could do the phenomenon that you just pointed out, which says, well, I can go vote on this ballot initiative here, and then at the top of the ticket, I can go vote for Trump, and I can feel good about it. I mean, Arizona, 62% of the people in Arizona voted for this ballot initiative, which Democrats would tend to think is a great thing, but then lose like 13% of that vote to Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, or maybe they only went for the ballot initiative and didn't go for the bottom of the ticket, or whatever. There was a fall off. So there's that. I wanted to address also just very quickly the question about landslides. And I agree with you normatively. I don't think that this was a landslide. I do think, again, looking at the trend lines, there's a clear shift that is concerning to me as a Democrat. I don't think it's a landslide for sure. And I think it would be unwise for Republicans to overestimate like the muscularity of their mandate here. But I do think for Democrats, there are some real warning signs about the direction of the country and about what it means to be a Democrat and why is that not inviting enough to enough people, right? Culturally, that's a real gut check question that Democrats have to ask themselves. And to that extent, when you look at the last few elections, that trend line is not looking good for Democrats. So that makes it feel like a landslide because of how Democrats maybe expected the night to go and how they've expected the last few cycles to go and what actually happened. So normatively, no, not a landslide, but the trend lines are really troubling.
Anyone else from the audience?
Hello, fellow alumnus, Matthew Dyes, class of 2023. Also building off the sort of mandate thing, I just have a hard time seeing it as a strong Republican mandate when the House has barely changed margins after 2 years of Republican infighting that led to pretty much no governing in the House. And since it might be even a closer margin than 2022, because they're still calling like 5 seats, I just was wondering sort of, first of all, where did the term mandate come from? Is this a new thing? Because I don't think I've ever remember hearing that before. And then sort of how, is it just sort of reading into what you want to read?
It came from Donald Trump.
Oh, okay.
Because he just started saying it, and so then we all picked up on it, and he owns the narrative, and he can dictate the narrative better than anybody else. And it's not a mandate. I mean, we still won 4 Senate seats in states that Kamala Harris lost. So there's a lot to be said here, but it's a cultural issue here that we're having, and I think people felt connected to Donald Trump. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, that Democrats had this with Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. People connected, and people came out, and so it felt very much different. But like if we look back, Joe Biden won the popular vote, Joe Biden won the Senate, and Joe Biden also had the House. So, and we weren't running around calling it a mandate because that's just not something that Democrats do. We never own something like that, and that's what Republicans are really good on the messaging.
I would say back to the point that I had made earlier about the change in tone. The Kamala Harris that ran in 2024 was completely unrecognizable from the Kamala Harris that ran in her primary in 2020. So looking at the tone, right? We're talking about decriminalizing border crossings, right? Like that was in vogue in 2020. That was a position that Kamala Harris supported. That is not a position that she decided that she wanted to support in 2024. So I think when you hear the term mandate, I think it's very specific as it relates to policies that Donald Trump advocated for, the American public voted for, and that even Democrats tried to cozy up to, right? Like I worked in a Senate race out there, one of the battleground Senate races, and I mean, ask anyone who worked on any of these Senate races, and they'd tell you what was the go-to line for Democrats. It was the Langford bill in the Senate that didn't end up materializing. They were not saying that Republican ideas are bad. They were saying, well, we tried to fix it, where they acknowledged that they created this massive problem and Republicans wouldn't help them fix it. We are now, or Donald Trump and Republican Congress is going to go ahead and act upon that. I think that's really the thrust of what a lot of folks are trying to get at. Setting aside different terms, I do think that pursuing a specific agenda is what they're going to try to accomplish.
Yeah, I get your point. Look, mandates, it's a communications tool, right? Like, it's something, if it's a mandate, it's not mandate, it doesn't change a single House seat, it doesn't change a single Senate seat, it doesn't change a single policy priority that Donald Trump's going to do, or if it was Harris, that she was going to do, right? It's a way to sell it. And I mean, the first time I heard it was in 2004. The last, Republican win the popular vote, George W. Bush called it a mandate in his acceptance speech, or his victory speech, the day after the election. And it matters to Jesse's point. It matters to what they do with it. What W screwed up on was he had a mandate, yes. What was the first thing he did? His first big policy priority, he went after to try to reform Social Security. And people were like, I didn't elect you to do that. Like, wait, what is this? So it's what you use the mandate for, right? The mandate for. Is it policies that you want on, okay, but really what the heart of it is that the public agrees with you with, right? Or is it something random? That's the difference.
But I think to our earlier point was, I don't think we know if this was a referendum on the Biden administration or this was we want Donald Trump back. And I think that's where he has to be careful with his mandate and what policies he enacts, because we don't know why people voted for him. And we don't know what was the callous for people voting for Donald Trump. And so I think that's where we're going to run in. Republicans could run into some problems because it's maybe not a mandate for immigration or a mandate for abortion or a mandate for certain things.
See, I mean, we're not blind with the exit polls. See, there is clear things that he absolutely won the issue on.
Here's one difference between now and 2016, 2017. It's a very different Republican Party that exists behind Donald Trump now. That was a timid, tepid Republican Party in 2016 that was supporting Trump. This is a full MAGA, respectfully, full MAGA Republican Party now. Even folks like Mike Lawler, who has a suburban New York City seat, right? He pretty much fell in line with the Trump agenda. Didn't really try to run away from him as much as I think some Democrats would have liked to been able to campaign against him. So, like, here's a difference, right, in terms of like how I think about the mandate. And it's a term that gets used a lot. Donald Trump does not have resistance from his own party now in the way that he did 8 years ago. So in the Senate, now you have a whole bunch of senators like Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, Mike Lee, Marsha Blackburn. You don't have as many Mitt Romneys. You don't have really any. There's like two. There's Susan Collins and there's Lisa Murkowski. And this guy from Utah that we got to see, Curtis. But like, you've got like 2 or 3 who are the type of Republicans who might join like a gang of 6 or a gang of 8. Pretty much the rest of the party are all MAGA, and they all have their political careers tied to Donald Trump. And that's very different than a Republican Party that he presided over in 2008. And that's a difference between this moment and that moment.
Any other questions from the audience?
Gabe D'Souza, class of 2027. Kind of building off on that last question and some of the points you guys raised, how do you see the Republican Party moving forward now that 4 years from now Trump can't run again, or at least I hope not? Is the gains made by the Republican Party because of Trump and his personality and who he is, or is it because of their policies and their narratives and all those things?
I have very strong feelings about this. So I'll start with this. I think, and this is all said with respect, my Republican friends have a bad habit of overreaching. And I think that this situation is very ripe for Republicans to overreach on anything from abortion to immigration policy to economic policy. I think if Republicans are able to apply some discipline to this moment, yes, they could build probably something resembling a long-lasting, standing, durable coalition that would really challenge Democrats. But I've been waging campaigns against Republicans for 20 years, and Republicans cannot help themselves because their base drives them towards unpopular things. And so I think that Republicans are probably in a moment where they think, let's go for the jugular, let's go for the big swing. Frankly, Republicans could go to school on what Joe Biden just went through in 2020 and 2021 and maybe take a little heat off the fastball. I don't think that that will happen, and I think that that will create an opportunity for Democrats to, at a minimum, challenge for one of the houses of Congress in 26. The Senate map is tough in 2026. The House is a lot more doable for Democrats in 2026. But I think that Republicans have a bad habit of overreaching. These guys might disagree with me, and I'd be very weary of doing that as a party that, frankly, has been a part of what some people might think. They might think that we overreached. I don't think that's the case, but yeah.
As the journalist up here, I'll just point out quickly, there's fresh reporting today that a Republican working group was talking to the transition about taking a run at Medicaid and some federal entitlements. So that reach might be there already.
Yeah, I actually wouldn't disagree with the idea that we can, left unfocused, could find ourselves in potentially perilous situations if we don't focus specifically on the things that we ran on, the issues that were most important, the issues that were most animating for our winning coalition. And that's fixing immigration, it's fixing the economy, that is having safer communities, that is dealing with some of the cultural issues that were topics of discussion during the campaign. I think remaining focused on those, you only get so many cracks at big ticket items in Congress, right? You're not going to be able to come in with wholesale change in 2 years just because this is more technical, but the calendar doesn't allow it. Normal function of government does not allow for all of these things to be done at a very high scale. There could be a lot of stuff done on the margins and 2 or 3 other big ticket items. But going to your point about what's the path forward for Republicans, I think it's a recognition that, one, if any Republican has learned anything since Donald Trump came down the escalator, is that you cannot replicate him. He is one of a kind. The things that he says, the things that he does, he has a significant bond with the American electorate that allows him to do those things. If you try to copycat that, you are not going to be successful. You have to be your own person, stylistically. But in terms of his rhetoric, in terms of his policy focus, we have undergone kind of a reorientation of who makes up the Republican electorate. And the idea of going back to some of the rhetoric, some of the policy ideas prior to Trump, if we think that's going to be a kind of a revert back to that sort of mode, absolutely not. And I think more Republican politicians have to focus on how Donald Trump speaks to certain economic concerns, the way that he appeals to the American working class, because that is the new base of the Republican Party. And I do think there are a lot of other good Republican politicians out there that have learned from that and are going to kind of put that on steroids going forward in terms of policy ideas. I will say that there is no one who will be as entertaining as Donald Trump running in 2028. He's one of a kind. It is what it is.
You're going to see a Republican Party two things. I think the country could say, well, 2016 was an aberration. No, I mean, he's looked at it again, right? There was something there. Now, it was a reaffirmation in many ways, him getting a second term, even though it was non-consecutive. So that's one thing. You're also going to see a Republican Party that is far more populist, far less deferential to big business than it was in the past, right? Mitt Romney's Republican Party is not coming down the escalator anymore, right? I think what I would expect is, you're already hearing this from J.D. Vance in his Joe Rogan interview. Watch pharmaceutical companies and big pharma, right? You're going to see a metaphorical target on their back in terms of, do they stop disallow advertising on television and other mediums, right? Where again in 2012 when we were coming up, like, they were, massive funders. We left them alone, and that is no longer the case. And I think you can thank COVID for that. You could thank kind of distrust in science, whether you believe that rightly or wrongly. But that was a huge part of this. So you're going to see a more populist Republican Party that is, again, you can't pretend to be Trump, but you can try to replicate his appeal in a very specific policy sense to the working class. And because, again, as I said before, it's the clearest indicator of where you're voting right now.
I think that the one thing we're missing here is Trump's policies on the economy are not for the working class, and his tariffs and his tax cuts are not based for the working class. And so I think that if those things get through Congress and those things pass and come into effect, Republicans are going to have a really hard time in the midterms and a really hard time claiming and in the presidential in 28, claiming the working class as part of their base, because you just won't have the policies.
He's been president before, though.
That TCJA was one of the more unpopular things that Republicans did when Donald Trump was president. You know what else was very unpopular? Going after the ACA. So, like, this is what I'm talking about, right? Like, Republicans can set some guardrails for themselves if they want. I think normatively what you said, Jesse, was right. Like, when we talk about fix immigration, I think a lot of people want to fix immigration, but it's all about, like, what does that mean? Does that mean, like, violently going and ripping people from their families and creating really ugly scenes and throwing people in concentration camps? Or does that mean doing targeted things in a orderly, bipartisan way, but maybe with a little bit more urgency? So that's different than what Donald Trump has been talking about. And I think that when people, like, I know that Republicans cite these big poll numbers about mass deportations. I think, again, that's one of those things where people hear, like, democracy and they think something else. I think people hear mass deportations and they think something else. I don't think it's what a lot of my Republican friends are reading it as, but that is the magic of the work that we do. We'll see when Trump tries to do some of these things, how it will impact the electorate.
All right, we are coming up on time. Last words from the panelists. What you're looking for the next 4 years? Go.
Beats me. No. I mean, look, I'm fascinated to see. You're going to have a Democratic Party that is in need of an identity. The 2028 race has already started. You're going to see folks talk about there. And then again, I think one underrated thing we haven't talked about, J.D. Vance had a very shaky start. I think anyone in our party will say that. When he was rolled out as a VP nominee, the debate and other things, doing a lot of mainstream media interviews, solidified his standing among the party. So he goes into 2028, I think, with a little bit more of a foothold than you would have said, 4 months ago, into 2028. He'll certainly get people running against him, but he starts out with a pretty good base of support.
I would just go off of what you were saying about the Democrats have an identity crisis. We also have a leader crisis, and we do not have a leader, and there's not a clear leader. And I think that in the next 6 months will be really telling where the Democratic Party moves to, and if they are able to regain some of the middle working class in those policies, with who's going to be the DNC chair and who's going to, sort of take hold of the party.
I'd say Democrats have never been in greater disarray, and Republicans have never been more united. It is the result of Donald Trump winning by an impressive margin versus expectations. I think that's important when you talk about, we talked about earlier, wow, it was actually a really close race. I just think everything is relative to expectations. No one gave him a shot at winning in 2016. No one thought he was going to win re-election in 2020, right, to the polls. The 2020 polls were way off, right? And then in 2024, if you remember, Kamala Harris had a fantastic debate. She did. She had a fantastic debate performance. There was a complete vibes campaign. Everyone thought she was in the driver's seat, and it wasn't until October that reality came crashing down. So I think a lot of Republicans right now are, for lack of a proper term, tipping their cap to Donald Trump and saying, you won. You came out and you actually did better than a lot of our House candidates and a lot of our Senate candidates. Well, clearly that is, and you brought in one of the most diverse coalitions of voters that we've had in decades, right? So it's not just, you're classic, country club Republican who came out in droves to support Trump. No, it was people from all different racial backgrounds, economic backgrounds, and I think that has really helped mesh what Republicans do going forward. And then if you look at Democrats, right, it's the nature of Joe Biden kind of leaving, midstream, right? Like that just leaves the party in kind of a, unknown place. And I think you're going to have to kind of find your way out of the wilderness. But look, no one party has dominated elections cycle after cycle after cycle after cycle. So Republicans shouldn't rest on their laurels either, because Democrats might figure it out next cycle, the cycle after that.
Yeah, I was teasing Jesse because we've been in disarray plenty. Just ask me and Meghan. Democrats, we exist in disarray. I also just want to thank you. You've been a captive, great audience. Thank you so much to the moderator, to the other panelists. This has been awesome. Nothing is permanent, and nothing is permanent, particularly in American politics. And we might be in an era where we are in a super transition era where we might have a lot of one-term presidents. We might go back and forth between parties. If you look at our history, that's not actually that uncommon, that you have these moments where the presidency just goes back and forth, and it can feel jarring, and we've gotten to this place where the elections are so existential because if you lose, you feel like not only have you lost an election, but you feel like you've lost a stake in the country. I don't know quite what to do about that, but I do like to remind people that nothing is permanent, particularly in politics. The last thing I would say, your point about leaders. I worked the 2008 presidential cycle. I worked for John Edwards. I'm really good at picking presidents. I worked for John Edwards and Hillary Clinton.
Join the club.
But that was an amazing race to work, amazing cycle to work. And I think Democrats in 2028 might be coming up on another one of those golden cycles. You look at the bench. Kamala Harris, I think, is a really talented woman. I don't think that most folks might consider her to be the front runner going into 2028, but she certainly could take a stake at it. Look at the Democratic governors around the country, the Wes Moores, the Gavin Newsoms, the J.B. Pritzkers, on and on and on, Gretchen Whitmer, Josh Shapiro, so on and so forth. You even have people now who are aligned to the Democratic Party like a Mark Cuban, who I wouldn't be surprised if you start hearing Democrats chatter about folks like that. You've got senators like Raphael Warnock, who went in tough states like Georgia. This is a golden era for Democratic politicians. This is a generational shift moment that we're in. And I do think the Democrats kind of played out their hand with Joe Biden, which is really like a remnant of the 2008 cycle. So it's kind of an interesting changing of the guard moment for Democrats. But just nothing's permanent. And I think Democrats have a really good bench going into 2028.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to all of our panelists. And thanks for a great discussion. Have a great night.